Lovely, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. From a real sort of view of the future, hopefully not too distant future, to something where I'm going to just drag us right back now to, well, hopefully not the past, but certainly a rather more practical present, because, you know, assessment of the angle and talking about gonioscopy is a very practical, pragmatic, daily skill that many of us probably do on a daily basis. But all the evidence, whenever anyone has tried to measure how often it is actually done in glaucoma practice, even by self-confessed glaucoma specialists around the world, and probably the most famous of those studies is from North America, looking at insurance claim data, found that actually it had been done surprisingly less often than it perhaps might have been, shall we say, just to save the blushes of anyone from the States. Certainly there was a lot less gonioscopy going than there ought to have been, and certainly there's a lot less accurate gonioscopy going on than there really ought to be at the moment, even in glaucoma practice. And that may be a reflection of inter-individual variability, or it may be just be a reflection of the fact that it's really, really difficult. Because it is also essential, because glaucoma, as I'm constantly telling registrars, is a diagnosis of exclusion, so that we need to be able to exclude, for open-angle glaucoma and ocular hypertension, we need to be able to exclude all those other causes of high pressure that we can, including angle closure. So we need to be doing gonioscopy on everyone, we all know that, but it is the essential step beyond which we cannot pass, and they should not proceed to make any type of diagnosis of POAG or OHT. And it really begins with a simplest of angle anterior chamber depth assessments and a limbal anterior chamber depth grading, which, despite some lovely research to the contrary, I would suggest is just a dichotomous test for the non-glaucoma guy. The person who's sitting there out in clinic saying, can I dilate this patient? The nurse who's sitting in a regular injection clinic saying, can we dilate this patient for their further medical retina follow-up? We need to be doing a limbal anterior chamber depth as that very first assessment before we even start the gonioscopy. And then in glaucoma clinics, they are all going to have a gonioscope placed on their eye at least once in their course through the clinic. But for other clinics, we need to be able to say yes or no, dichotomous test, does this patient need gonioscopy before we go any further? A very wide number of alternatives to gonioscopy have over the years been explored, investigated, suggested, and yet none of them has actually taken the crown of placing a contact lens on the eye and looking very carefully ourselves. It kicked off with Scheimpflug photography, first used in the late 70s, 80s, and then developed in various ways, but limited by penetration into the angle. UBM, an automated assessment, earlier anterior segment OCTs, and later, more recent anterior segment OCTs with dedicated infrared cameras and viewing optics that allow really very, very exquisite pictures and cross-sectional imaging, but still don't take the crown away from a good gonioscopy lens because of the additional information that you can get with that. What are we looking for? Well, primarily, of course, but not exclusively, we're looking for iridotrabecular contact to detect angle closure. And some of the four fundamental questions that have been posed within that context is the iris touching the trabecular meshwork? If so, how much and where? If not, are there signs that it has been doing so in the past? And if it is touching it, is that contact in fact reversible? And if there are synechia, how bad are they? I call them Foster's questions because Paul initially formulated them in that format. We're initially doing this in the context of static, primary position, dark room gonioscopy without indentation with a high magnification MagnaView type lens in order to identify contact between iris and trabecular meshwork. And to do that, we need to really refine and carefully define the specific landmark. Can we have the lights down, top lights down if we may, please? We really need to refine and define the landmarks, and that is specifically Shawbay's line as the anterior most extent of the trabecular meshwork by defining the corneoscleral wedge and the corneoscleral junction, and offsetting the lamp housing of the microscope so that we can view that optical cross-section of the peripheral corneal sclera from a slight side-on angle so that we can identify the specific target of our examination. And this, and without this, it's very difficult to really be sure where you are within the angle. And with this, there comes a great deal of additional confidence for identifying those angle structures and the presence of subtle degrees, often of quite subtle low or posterior, often pigmented, trabecular meshwork contact that actually may well contribute to a diagnosis of angle closure. And that if we don't identify them carefully, we won't pick up and we won't be able to reliably see with the gonioscope. So here is a simple still image looking at, do we have any luck with the top lights at all? Can we dim the lights very slightly? I mean, I just know that there's a couple of things coming up which we won't see at all if the lights are up. So the corneoscleral junction with the endothelial and identifying the position of Chauvet's line and therefore the position of trabecular meshwork, and that is the sine qua non, the absolute requirement to be really able to pick up what it is that we're looking for. And this is another comparable but slightly more angulated lamp housing offset more picture of the same structure, where in this example there is a clear identification of corneoscleral wedge and thereby a trabecular meshwork beyond that. And here's an example of a closed, rather than the previous slide, open angle. This is a closed angle where the corneoscleral wedge does not show beyond the very most tip. There is no visible structure seen. So we've got a reflection from iris, the reflection from the wedge there, endothelial, epithelial reflections, and then we cannot see structures beyond that in the recess of the angle. Now there is likely to be, therefore, buried within there, iridotrabecular contact. And Willau's beautiful colour atlas of gonioscopy really very nicely was one of the first to describe quite how important that was, with a very, very thin, narrow beam showing that we could be completely confused by the strips and bands of colour deep within the angle if we were not very careful to identify those structures that would reveal to us the position of the corneoscleral wedge and thereby reveal to us the position from which we know trabecular meshwork is beginning to extend posteriorly, and therefore the precise position of the potential iridotrabecular contact. Here we have a very narrow beam with corneoscleral wedge coming down to a Chauvet's line here, a brighter, broader beam with the usual problems of gonioscopy videos of the very narrow dynamic range of the cameras, but you can see there is the wedge, and then beyond that are structures. Beyond that is angles. So whether that is a featureless angle or an angle with multiple strips of pigmentation buried within it, we can be certain that whichever structures we are looking at are therefore beyond that trabecular meshwork going down towards scleral spur, and then in some patients obviously ciliary body face, but not always. So that is the examination that we need to do to identify the basic landmarks, and then from there look for the iridotrabecular contact in primary position without manipulation, without indentation, without the next step, which is dynamic gonioscopy to force open any angle that may appear to be closed and see whether it stays closed when you press on the eye and get them to be indented. Now, we're looking specifically for peripheral anterior synechia, which may flag up nicely and stand there waving their hands, clear to see by all, and sometimes it's a lot more subtle than that, and then the whole of the angle may simply look very shallow with an apparent high insertion until you find an area where actually more trabecular meshwork is visible, and you realize that actually you were looking at an area of very broad peripheral anterior synechia. That's what we're hoping to find. We do not need to use a 4-mirror gonioscope for this, although those do work very well, because a large high magnification, even large Goldman style lens can be used for that if you get the patient to refixate and look into the mirror. We're also looking for signs of abnormal pigmentation, but particularly signs of pigment smudging on the anterior trabecular meshwork face, and particularly abnormal signs of smudging that match and mirror the type of pigment that is on the anterior iris surface. This dark coffee ground tide mark here is pigment that's been banged off the back of the iris from a YAG laser iridotomy. The angle has opened up, and it's revealed that the anterior iris surface has left a smudging of anterior iris pigment on the trabecular meshwork face and the posterior trabecular meshwork face here, so that we can see that there has been contact in the past. Looking for that specific sign when we're looking very carefully for subtle signs of angle closure in patients where sometimes it's very hard to identify precisely what's going on, is occasionally enough to push us into perhaps a prophylactic laser iridotomy when we might not otherwise have been certain that was indicated. So we're asking whether the iris is touching the trabecular meshwork, and if so, how much and where. If not, are there any previous signs such as that there were or has been contact, and if the iris is in contact, is it reversible? And the dynamic gonioscopy, looking for subtle signs of previous pigmentation hidden behind the iris, and also looking for this peripheral anterior synechia, simply increasing the intensity of the light and asking the patient to refixate towards the mirror is often enough, with little gentle manipulation of a Goldman-style Magnaview type lens, is often enough just to get the angle to open up enough to see whether or not that iris is permanently adherent to trabecular meshwork, or whether it's simply reversible apposition or closure. And there's much debate about whether or not this is really possible. There are some that say you simply can't do that with a Goldman lens. You can, because we do it on a daily basis, and you just need to get a good understanding of the precise landmarks and the initial anatomy. And this is just showing that if we don't know if this is going to let me bring this forward. Just showing that what was really narrow and closed can be opened up widely. So these are the questions that I'll leave you with to think about in the context of angle closure and gonioscopy. Clearly there are a lot more pathologies that we need to be looking for in the angle, and it is fundamentally the diagnosis and identification of the corneoscleral wedge from which everything else follows on. I would recommend gonio or gonioscopy.org as a great site and source of gonio video for anyone who wants to look at exciting pictures of angle pathology late at night when they've nothing else to do.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.